At the sale barn, a three-legged goat sold for $20 because nobody else wanted her. The auctioneer nearly gave her away for free. A young woman bought her anyway, following one line her late mother left behind about milk and patience. Everyone at that sale barn laughed. Nobody laughed 2 years later, when her small cheese brand couldn't keep up with the orders coming in. Maren Kessler was 26 years old the day she bought a three-legged goat for $20, because nobody else in the building wanted her. And if you've ever spent your last bit of grocery money on something everyone told you was foolish, stick with us tonight and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Maren had been running her late mother's small dairy goat operation alone for almost 2 years by then, ever since Lucille Kessler passed away from a sudden illness that had given the family barely 6 weeks of warning before taking her entirely. The farm produced just enough milk, most months to cover feed and basic bills, and Maren had learned quickly how thin that margin actually was, once she was the only one managing it. She still went to the monthly livestock auction at the county sale barn, out of habit more than strategy, usually just to see what culls or older does might be worth adding cheap to bolster her small herd. That particular Thursday, the auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Cal Pruitt, who'd run that sale barn for going on 20 years, brought out a nanny goat missing most of her left hind leg, the result of an old accident nobody bothered explaining in detail, and the crowd's reaction made clear immediately what everybody else thought she was worth. Cal opened the bidding low, hoping for even a token offer, joking to the room that somebody ought to take her off his hands before she became a permanent fixture in his holding pen. Nobody raised a card. The room stayed quiet enough that Maren could hear the goat's uneven, careful footsteps against the concrete as she was led in a slow circle for display. Maren raised her hand before she'd fully decided to, offering $20 into a silence that had clearly expected the animal to go for nothing at all or get turned away entirely. A few chuckles moved through the crowd behind her, and one man near the front row, a regular buyer named Dale Vance, known locally for running one of the larger dairy operations in the county, said loud enough for half the room to hear that Maren must be running charity work now instead of an actual farm, since no sensible person paid good money for a three-legged goat that would never keep pace with a normal herd. Maren didn't answer him. She paid Cal her $20 and led the goat out to her truck with considerably more care than the animal's sale price seemed to warrant to anyone watching. She named the goat Clover on the drive home, mostly because the animal had chewed contentedly on a scrap of clover Maren offered her at a stoplight, seemingly unbothered by the missing leg, in a way that struck Maren as almost stubborn in its own quiet way. Getting Clover settled into the small barn behind the house took some adjusting, building a slightly modified stall setup so the goat could move comfortably without competing directly with the rest of the herd for space at the feed trough, Maren told herself, driving home with $20 less in her pocket and a genuinely impractical animal in her truck bed that she'd simply acted on impulse, nothing more complicated than that. That evening, sitting at her kitchen table going through bills that never seemed to get any lighter, no matter how carefully she budgeted, Maren found herself thinking about her mother more than she had in weeks, missing the particular way Lucille used to talk about the herd, like each goat carried its own personality, worth understanding rather than simply managing. On impulse, she went looking through a box of her mother's old things she hadn't fully unpacked since the funeral, pulling out Lucille's handwritten recipe book, water-stained and held together with a rubber band, full of cheese and yogurt recipes passed down from Lucille's own grandmother decades earlier. Flipping through pages she'd looked at dozens of times before without really reading closely, Maren noticed something in the margin near the back she'd apparently skipped past every previous time, a short note in her mother's handwriting, added sometime later than the recipe itself, judging by the different ink, that had nothing to do with any specific recipe on that page. It read simply that the goats who struggled hardest to walk gave the richest milk, patience rewarded slower than anybody wanted to wait for. Maren read the line twice, sitting at her kitchen table with a three-legged goat currently settling into her barn outside, wondering whether her mother had actually meant something specific by that note, or whether grief was simply making her look for meaning in an old woman's passing observation that had never been intended as any kind of instruction at all. Lucille Kessler had built the small dairy operation from almost nothing over 3 decades, starting with 2 goats her own mother had given her as a wedding gift and growing it slowly into the modest herd Maren inherited, never large enough to be called a real business by county standards, but steady enough to support a family that lived simply. Maren had grown up helping with milking before school most mornings, absorbing her mother's particular habits and superstitions about the herd, without always understanding the reasoning behind them, the way children absorb things from parents they trust completely, without needing full explanations. That trust, more than any actual proof, was what kept Maren from dismissing the note in the recipe book outright, however impractical it seemed on its face. She started milking Clover separately from the rest of the herd within the first week, partly out of practical necessity given the goats' mobility limitations, and partly, if she was honest with herself, out of simple curiosity about whether her mother's odd note held any truth at all. The difference showed up almost immediately. Clover's milk came out visibly richer than the rest of the herd's, a noticeably higher cream line forming when Maren let a jar settle overnight, and when she finally tested the butterfat content properly, the number came back considerably higher than anything else her herd produced, higher than what most dairy goat breeds typically managed at all. Maren mentioned the discovery to her older sister, Paige, who lived 2 towns over and had left the farm behind years earlier for a more stable office job, largely because she'd watched their mother struggle financially for most of her adult life and wanted something more secure for herself. Paige's reaction was practical, in the way Paige's reactions usually were, suggesting plainly that 1 goat's rich milk wasn't worth building anything around, and that Maren would be better served focusing her limited time on expanding the main herd rather than fixating on a single 3-legged animal that couldn't produce nearly enough volume to matter financially either way. Maren heard her out without much argument, though she found herself, later that same week, quietly setting aside a full week's worth of Clover's milk, instead of blending it into the general supply, the way Paige had suggested made more sense. Using one of her mother's simpler recipes from the water-stained book, a soft farmhouse cheese that traditionally required nothing more exotic than good milk, patience, and proper temperature control, Maren made her first small batch, using nothing but Clover's milk, working in her kitchen late one evening after regular chores were finished. The batch came out small, barely enough to fill 2 jars, but the texture and flavor, even to Maren's untrained palate, tasted noticeably different from anything she'd made previously, using the general herd's milk. Richer and more complex, in a way she didn't have the vocabulary yet to properly describe. She brought a small wedge of it to the farmer's market the following Saturday, almost as an afterthought, tucked at the corner of her regular table alongside the eggs and standard goat cheese she usually sold, not expecting much beyond maybe a curious taste or 2 from regular customers. A woman Maren didn't recognize, dressed a bit more polished than the market's usual crowd, stopped at her table mid-morning, sampled the small wedge on a whim, and went noticeably quiet for a moment before asking Maren directly what exactly she'd done differently with this particular batch. The woman introduced herself as Renata Cole, a chef who ran a small but well-regarded farm-to-table restaurant about 40 minutes away, explaining that she sourced local dairy products regularly and rarely came across anything at a small county market with this kind of depth of flavor. She asked, plainly and without any pretense, whether Maren could supply her restaurant with more of whatever she'd just tasted, mentioning a quantity that would have required considerably more than 1 goat's weekly milk output to fulfill even partially. Maren stood at her market table, holding Renata's business card, doing quick, uncomfortable math in her head about exactly how much cheese 1 3-legged goat could realistically produce against a request this size, and realizing, with a mixture of excitement and genuine worry, that she'd just accidentally created a demand her entire current operation had absolutely no way of meeting. She told Renata honestly that she'd need some time to figure out whether she could scale the recipe at all without losing whatever made it work in the first place, and Renata, seeming more amused than discouraged by the hesitation, said she'd rather wait for something done right than rush into something ordinary, and left her number with instructions to call whenever Maren had an answer. Maren spent the following weeks trying to figure out how to stretch one goat's milk supply into something resembling a real answer for Renata, testing whether blending small amounts of Clover's milk into batches made mostly from the regular herd's supply preserved any of the flavor that had impressed the chef in the first place. The results came back inconsistent at best, the distinctive richness fading noticeably once Clover's milk made up less than roughly a third of any given batch, which meant scaling the recipe honestly required either an impossibly large amount of milk from one three-legged goat or some other solution Maren hadn't figured out yet. She called Renata back within 2 weeks with a smaller commitment than originally requested, enough to supply the restaurant modestly rather than fully, and Renata agreed readily enough, telling Maren that consistent quality mattered more to her than volume anyway. That modest supply agreement should have been the easy part, but a letter arrived from the county health department not long after Maren's first delivery, informing her that producing cheese for commercial sale, even in small quantities to a single restaurant, required proper licensing and a certified kitchen space that met specific dairy production codes her home kitchen didn't currently satisfy. Someone, likely a competitor or an overly cautious neighbor, had apparently flagged her farmer's market sales to the county, prompting the inspection notice, now sitting on Maren's kitchen table, alongside bills that hadn't gotten any easier to manage since her mother passed. The estimate Maren got from a contractor for building out a small certified cheese kitchen in her existing barn space came back higher than she had any reasonable way of covering, several $1,000s beyond what her current savings or monthly income from the herd could stretch to accommodate. She got 2 more estimates from different contractors over the following days, hoping for a more manageable number, but each came back close enough to the first that hoping for a lucky break on price alone clearly wasn't going to solve the problem. She considered, briefly, simply telling Renata she couldn't continue supplying the restaurant at all, letting the whole opportunity quietly disappear the way most small, promising things on a struggling farm tended to disappear once real costs entered the picture. Paige, when Maren mentioned the situation over the phone, offered to lend her part of the money, though even combined with what Maren could scrape together herself, the total still fell short of what the upgrade actually required. While Maren was still turning that math over, trying to find some version of the numbers that worked, Clover stopped eating properly one morning, standing listless near the back of her modified stall, instead of coming forward for her usual feed. Maren noticed immediately, having grown attuned to the goat's normal habits over the past several months, and by early afternoon, Clover's condition had worsened considerably, labored breathing and a fever Maren could feel plainly with her hand pressed against the goat's side. The regular vet, when Maren finally reached him after 2 unanswered calls, couldn't make it out until the following morning, leaving Maren to sit with Clover through the night, doing what limited care she knew how to provide, cooling the goat's fever with damp cloths, the same way she vaguely remembered her mother doing for a sick animal years earlier. She found herself talking to Clover through those hours in a way that probably would have embarrassed her if anybody had been there to hear it, telling the goat plainly that she needed her to pull through, that an entire small, fragile business had somehow ended up depending on one 3-legged animal nobody else at that sale barn had wanted at any price. By morning, Clover hadn't improved, her breathing shallow and her eyes dull in a way that frightened Maren more than she wanted to admit even to herself. The vet arrived a little after 8, examined Clover thoroughly, drew blood for testing, and told Maren plainly that it looked like a serious respiratory infection, the kind that could go either way, depending on how quickly they caught it and how the goat's body responded to treatment, though her age and the stress of her physical limitations complicated things somewhat beyond a typical case. Maren stood in the barn doorway, watching the vet work, one hand pressed against the wall to steady herself, aware in a way she hadn't fully let herself feel until that exact moment just how much had ended up resting on this one goat's survival, not just sentimentally, but literally, an entire cheese business, a restaurant contract, and quite possibly her mother's whole legacy sitting balanced on whatever the vet's next words turned out to be. She realized, standing there, that she hadn't even told Renata yet that the goat behind all of it was sick, unsure whether that was a conversation worth having, before she knew which direction this morning was actually going to go. The vet's blood work came back late that afternoon, confirming the respiratory infection, but catching it early enough, combined with an aggressive course of antibiotics, to give Clover a genuinely good chance at recovery. He warned Maren the next several days would matter most, that older goats with physical limitations sometimes struggled to bounce back the way a younger, more mobile animal would, but he seemed cautiously optimistic standing there in the barn, packing up his supplies. Maren spent that week administering medication on a strict schedule, barely leaving the property, watching Clover's appetite return slowly, then steadily, until by the following weekend the goat was moving around her stall with something close to her usual stubborn energy again. It was during a follow-up exam the vet insisted on scheduling, checking Clover's overall recovery a week later, that he mentioned almost offhand, something Maren hadn't considered at all amid the crisis. Clover appeared to be pregnant, likely bred before the sale barn ever put her up for auction, far enough along that she'd deliver sometime in the coming weeks, assuming the pregnancy held despite the recent illness. Maren sat with that information a long moment, doing the same uncomfortable math she'd been doing about milk volume for weeks now, except this time the numbers suddenly looked considerably more hopeful than they had before. Clover delivered twin doelings on a quiet Tuesday morning in early spring, both healthy, both, as it turned out over their following months of growth, carrying the same distinctive richness in their milk once they matured enough to test, confirming what the vet had gently theorized during one of Clover's checkups, that whatever combination of genetics and altered movement patterns from her missing leg had concentrated the fat content in her milk seemed to be an inheritable trait rather than something specific to Clover's individual condition alone. Maren finally had, for the first time since Renata's original request, a realistic path toward actually scaling her supply without stretching one animal past what she could reasonably produce. Renata, once Maren explained the full situation, including the code compliance costs still standing between her and legal commercial production, offered something Maren hadn't expected from a chef she'd known only a few months. Renata proposed fronting a portion of the kitchen upgrade costs herself, treating it as an investment in a long-term exclusive supply arrangement rather than simple charity, structuring the deal so Maren would pay the amount back gradually through discounted future deliveries rather than needing the full sum up front. She told Maren plainly that she'd rather help build something worth waiting for than watch a good product disappear over a bureaucratic hurdle, a sentiment that meant more to Maren than the money itself. Combined with Paige's earlier offer and Maren's own savings, the numbers finally came together enough to bring in the contractor and get the barn kitchen built out to proper code within 2 months. With the kitchen finally certified and Clover's growing line of daughters providing a genuinely sustainable milk supply, Maren's small cheese operation expanded steadily over the following year, eventually supplying 2 more local restaurants beyond Renata's, alongside her regular farmers market sales. She thought often, during that stretch, about her mother's strange marginal note, and it was going through an older box of Lucille's things one evening, looking for a specific recipe, that Maren finally found the fuller context she'd been missing. A photograph, tucked between recipe pages, showed a young Lucille standing beside a goat with an obviously similar leg deformity, decades earlier, with a note on the back, in her grandmother's handwriting, mentioning that very animal by name, calling her the finest milker they'd ever kept. Maren understood then that her mother's note hadn't been some abstract philosophy about patience and struggle at all. It had been a specific, remembered fact, passed down from Lucille's own mother, about one particular kind of goat worth paying attention to whenever the opportunity came around again, quietly waiting in a recipe book for exactly the right moment to matter to somebody. Maren still keeps that photograph pinned above her new certified kitchen counter, next to her mother's original recipe book, and she thinks of Lucille every time she separates out Clover's milk from the rest of the growing herd. If this story reminded you that the things everyone else overlooks sometimes carry exactly what you need, stay with us and subscribe, because we've got more stories like Maren and Lucille's about the wisdom that gets passed down quietly until somebody's finally ready to use it.